Alright you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out you guys, this story right here is another one that I've had for a while. But for one reason or another, I wasn't able to put it out. So the events in this story took place on June 19, 2014, sometime between 10 and 11 p.m. at night. And on that night, there was a female by the name of Letty Garcia who was driving her van when she spotted two individuals that she recognized as Silent and Dreamer from 18th Street. They were standing in front of a liquor store on the corner of 54th Street and Normandy Avenue in Los Angeles, California. And this particular storefront that was called Leva's Market was a well-known hangout where 18th Street gang members were known to post up and congregate in front of. But it was also an area where Temple Street, another gang who had an ongoing rivalry with 18th Street, were also known to frequent. So Letty knew Silent and Dreamer and a lot of other 18th Street gang members due to the fact that she was romantically involved with an 18th Street gang member by the name of Henry Cayeros, who was also known as Tricky. So as Letty continued to make her way across the intersection of 54th Street and Normandy, Silent and Dreamer flagged her down in motion for her to pull over. Letty's van was obviously well known amongst 18th Street gang members. And because it was a van and was able to carry multiple occupants, it was a favored way for groups of them to get around and ride at different locations in that area. And again, because of Letty's relationship with Tricky, she didn't seem to mind giving them a ride around the neighborhood. However, the same way this van was recognized by a lot of 18th Street gang members, it was also recognized by a lot of their rivals and other gang members that they had problems with in the past as well. It had been shot at, involved in several crimes, and it still bore some of the bullet holes that kind of served as some of its past battle scars. So when Letty pulled up to the curb, Silent and Dreamer asked her if she could give them a ride to another 18th Street gang member's house that was located near MacArthur Park. And she told them that she'd take them there, but that first she had to shoot by one of her friend's house that lived near the corner of Vernon Avenue and Hoover Street. So when they got to Letty's friend's house, Letty told them that she was going to only be in there for about 10 or 15 minutes and that she was going to leave the keys with them so that they could listen to the radio. You know, these were fellow 18th Streeters and they were friends of her old man Tricky's, so they had that coming. Otherwise, she probably wouldn't have trusted him. So true to her word, Letty stayed inside for about 15 minutes, and then when she came back outside to give these guys a ride, they were gone. They took off with their van and they didn't say nothing. You know, on a side note, these guys either didn't have any respect for Tricky or they were aware of the fact that Letty was nothing more than a side piece to Tricky and that he wouldn't have cared one way or the other that they did that to her. Because you don't do a good homie's girl like that. Not one that you respect. So again, either Tricky was a slouch who they didn't have any respect for, or they knew Letty was nothing more than a side piece who Tricky didn't give two shits about. At any rate, when Letty seen that her van was gone and that they had taken off, she tried calling both of them on their cell phones, but neither one of them answered. And she kept speed dialing both numbers and even tried blocking their number so that they couldn't see it was her calling. But after several minutes, it was obvious that they weren't going to answer her calls. So as for Silent and Dreamer, they were on a mission. They were both broke and they wanted to make some fast money. They wanted to hit some licks and they needed the van to do it. You know, when I was younger and we used to go on these types of crime sprees, we used to do it the same way. There was no planning and we usually didn't have any set targets. We would just jack whoever we seen out there in the streets, and it was all a matter of opportunity. If you look like you have money on you, then in a split-second decision, you became a target. It was as simple as that. I used to call these nickel and dime robberies because most of the time they were low volume robberies. We usually get 50 or 60 bucks here and there, and we'd be lucky if we got more than a couple $100. Sometimes we'd use weapons and sometimes we'd just go hands on. Again, it was all a matter of opportunity, and this was obviously what Silent and Dreamer were doing. So the first thing they did after they took off with Letty's van was to drive out by MacArthur Park to pick up one of their boys, an individual by the name of Cesar Reyes, who was also known as Bone. And once they picked him up, the hunt was on. They started looking for potential victims. So at about 11:30 p.m., about 30 minutes after they took off with Letty's van, an individual by the name of Miguel Ruiz came out of his house and made a beeline for the trunk of his car. His car was parked on the street directly in front of his house, where he usually parked it every night. And as he was going through the trunk of his car, Silent, Dreamer, and Bone pulled Letty's van right up alongside his car. Bone got out of the front passenger seat while Dreamer opened up the side sliding door and got out the back. Silent stayed inside the van at the wheel just in case they had to smash out in a hurry for whatever reason. So Dreamer put his gun in Miguel's face and told him not to turn around, to look away, and he complied. Then Dreamer proceeded to slap all his pockets with the back of his hand, looking for anything of value. Money, jewelry, drugs, whatever he could find. He ended up taking this guy's driver's license, his medical marijuana card, and some Gorilla Glue that he had in a small Ziploc baggie in his pocket. Some bomb-ass medical grade marijuana that he had just picked up from one of the local dispensaries. Meanwhile, as Bone ripped the car stereo out of the dash, Dreamer pointed the gun to the back of this guy Miguel's head and just watched him until Bone was done. What happened next was comical. As Bone was breaking apart the dash and reaching under the stereo to yank it out, both of his hands got sliced up by razor blades that had been soldered to both sides of the stereo. This is actually an old school trick that people used to do back in the 80s. I never did it myself, but I knew people that did. It's just crazy to know that people are still doing it all these years later. But what they would basically do is attach razor blades to the sides and back of the stereo by soldering them on. It's basically a crude form of your own anti-theft security. It'll definitely mess somebody's day up pretty bad. It's sabotage, and anybody that makes the mistake of sticking their hands anywhere behind the stereo is gonna get sliced up. In fact, Bone ended up slicing up both of his hands, and as a result, he left DNA evidence all over the inside of this guy's car. Something that would end up coming back to haunt him later. And because his hands looked like hamburger meat, he ended up getting so mad that he socked this guy Miguel for not telling him about the razor blades. You know, I'm assuming he probably used a shirt or a rag to finish getting the stereo out once he found out about the razor blades. But either way, after he finished yanking out all the speakers and the amplifiers, Dreamer told Miguel to start walking towards his front door while he kept the gun to the back of his head. You know, this guy Miguel probably started freaking out thinking that they were about to go inside his house where his family was at and ransack it. But this was only part of their exit strategy to create some distance so that they could take off. After this guy took a couple of steps, Dreamer stopped and told him to keep walking towards his front gate. He said, just don't look back. If you do, you're gonna get shot. And once again, this guy complied, but unfortunately for Dreamer and Bone, he had already gotten a visual on both of them. So when he was far enough, they both jumped back in the van and then Silent took off. Anyways, 2 days after the robbery, the victim, Miguel Ruiz, identified both Dreamer and Bone through six-pack photo lineups. And he positively identified Dreamer as the one who frisked him down and held a gun to his head, and he identified Bone as the one who took his car stereo. At any rate, a Los Angeles police detective named Dean Van Leeuwen was the one who was assigned to work the case. And as a secondary form of positively identifying these guys, he also had a criminologist come in and swab some of the blood that was left on the inside of the car. And this was obviously used to perform DNA testing so that they could get a DNA profile. And later when the results came back, Bone was again positively identified. So later on when they tried to prosecute this case, the victim Miguel Ruiz was so fearful of these guys being 18th Street gang members that he expressed fear in testifying against them. In fact, he failed to show up to court twice despite being subpoenaed. And eventually he was even charged with contempt of court and placed in custody. So after he initially made pretrial identifications, he apparently found out that his girlfriend's friends knew Dreamer's girl. And from that point on, it was a wash. When the case finally did go to trial, Miguel came in and testified that Dreamer and Bone weren't the two guys that robbed him and that it must have been somebody else. And at that point, the only thing that connected him to that case was the DNA evidence. But in the end, that wasn't enough. So less than 2 hours later that same night, sometime around 1:40 a.m., Silent was still driving Letty's van looking for more potential victims when they spotted a rival gang member who they believed was from Temple Street. And before I get into the details of what occurred, this is something else for you guys to keep in mind. You know, I've actually talked about this several times in the past, and this is something everyone that's watching this video needs to remember. Not necessarily because you might be out there committing criminal acts, but just for your own awareness regardless of whatever it is you might be doing. But they say that when you step outside your front door, that the average person is caught on video or camera anywhere from 34 to 75 times per day, totaling roughly 240 plus times a week. You know, think about that. Those are crazy numbers, and that's the average. In this time and day with social media and all the other things that are going on in this world, there's cameras everywhere. And these numbers fluctuate depending on different factors. But the one thing you guys need to remember is that just because you don't visibly see a camera doesn't mean you're not being recorded. Most of the time, you're not going to see it, but trust me, they're still there. Whether it's a security camera, home or industrial, drones, surveillance systems, somebody's cell phone, or some other type of media or video technology that's out there, somebody's always watching. For all you 80s babies, this reminds me of 1984 when that song by Rockwell came out called Somebody's Watching Me. But anyways, trip out. I remember being in situations where we were getting ready to do something, and one of the individuals that I was with did a quick visual scan around to see if he could see any visible cameras. And when he did it, I just remember thinking, that's cool if you can visually spot a camera and you know it's there. But most of the time, people place cameras in inconspicuous places so that you can't see them. And they do that so that they can catch you slipping. You know, I personally just assume that there's always cameras or people taking video whenever I'm out there in the streets. Anyways, fast forward back to where I was at. Like I said, later on that night, sometime around 1:40 a.m., Silent, Dreamer, and Bone spotted a rival gang member on the corner of 54th Street and Figueroa Avenue. So when they got to the intersection and they got close to where this individual was walking, Silent, who was still driving, stopped the van and pulled over. Dreamer opened up the side sliding door and started shooting at the same time as Bone, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, leaning out the window. Both of them were firing their guns, and they continued shooting until their guns were empty. Jose Horta, who I'm now going to refer to as Blackie for the purpose of this story, never even knew what hit him. He died right there on the sidewalk before the ambulance and fire department got there about 6 minutes later. He had been hit 3 times in the head. One of the bullets perforated his aorta. Both of his lungs were punctured, which caused him to drown in his own blood. He took a bullet in the spleen, in his liver, and he was also hit in the neck as well. He had 5 bullet wounds that were all considered to be fatal, any one of which could have been the one that ended his life. But again, he probably died before he hit the ground. So when the shooting occurred, apparently there were 2 LAPD officers on patrol in an unmarked police car that had just turned on Figueroa Avenue and 54th Street. So Sergeant Joe Skeeta and his partner David Gonzalez both heard 5 or 6 gunshots that they would later claim sounded like a .22 caliber firearm, and then a second additional firearm that also sounded like it was small caliber. They would also later say that they came in 2 separate rapid successions, where there was a short pause after the first burst of gunfire, then a few seconds later, a second burst of about 5 or 6 more shots. Coincidentally, from their vantage point, they were able to look north on Figueroa Avenue and see Letty's van stopped about a block away in the middle of the street. And from where they were at, they were also able to see Blackie standing outside the van and fall to the ground as soon as they heard the first few gunshots. Believing that they might have just witnessed a drive-by shooting, they proceeded to drive north in the direction of the van. But as they began to drive in that direction, the van attempted to flee the area by driving south down Figueroa Avenue towards them. And when they were crossing paths in either direction, they were so close that Silent actually made eye contact with Sergeant Skeeta. Needless to say, this caused Sergeant Skeeta, who was driving, to make a U-turn and to activate his lights and siren. Silent, on the other hand, definitely had no intentions on stopping or complying. So from there, the felony pursuit was on. So Silent jumped on the 110 freeway going southbound, and by this time several other black and white LAPD police cruisers joined in on the chase. So at one point, Silent actually got the van up to 120 miles per hour, weaving in and out of LA traffic, despite it being right about the time when commute hour was just starting to back up. You know, up until they had 2 or 3 cops behind him, Silent was confident that he could shake them. But by the time they got to the Manchester Avenue exit, there was at least 20 to 25 cops behind him. Anyone who's seen this pursuit as it was taking place probably thought it was reminiscent to when Al Cowling had O.J. Simpson in his white Ford Bronco, and they were on the freeway navigating, trying to get away from half of LAPD. Anyways, from all accounts, Silent's driving was pretty impressive, because not only was he able to push the van to its limits, but there was also several times when he got so far ahead of the cops that they actually lost sight of him. So it was at this point that Bone and Dreamer decided to toss their weapons out the window. They were obviously trying to get away, but they probably figured just in case they got caught, it'd be better if they played it safe. Meanwhile, Silent eventually jumped on the 105 going westbound, continuing to weave in and out of traffic until he finally got off on the Sepulveda Boulevard exit. And for those of you familiar with this area, he drove through that small tunnel under LAX and attempted to turn on the Lincoln Parkway, but as he made that turn, he ended up losing control of the van and crashed near the exit. So when the smoke cleared and they finally got their bearings, Silent and Bone jumped out of the van and fled on foot. They managed to get about a block away, but eventually they were both caught and taken into custody. And for whatever reason, Dreamer stayed in the van and was arrested sitting in the rear passenger seat. And unfortunately for Dreamer, after they put him in cuffs and searched him, they found Ruiz's driver's license in his pocket. This was the guy that they robbed before they committed the homicide. You know, once again, this is another one of those mental mistakes that didn't do nothing but link him to that robbery. Who knows why he kept this guy's driver's license? Maybe he was in identity theft, something that's pretty common nowadays, and he had plans to do something with it later. But keeping an ID or a driver's license of one of your victims in your pocket isn't a smart thing to do. So when the cops searched the van, they also found 2 expended .38 caliber shell casings and a third on the ground just outside the van. They also found Ruiz's car stereo that was still covered and caked with Bone's blood. Meanwhile, as these cops continue to process the evidence that they found and transport Silent, Bone, and Dreamer to the substation, other officers were responding to the crime scene on 54th Street and Figueroa Avenue where Blackie had been gunned down. There, they recovered an expended .38 caliber shell casing, 1 expended bullet, and 3 bullet fragments from the area where Blackie had been shot. So later, a criminologist by the name of Jessica Moody in the Los Angeles Police Department's Firearms Analysis Unit test-fired the recovered .22 caliber revolver and compared the expended shell casings and bullets that were recovered from the scene of the shooting and from the van that Silent was driving. And this criminologist Moody determined that the 2 bullets that were recovered from Blackie's body during the autopsy had been fired from the same .22 caliber revolver, and that an additional bullet that was recovered from Blackie's clothing following the shooting had also been fired from the same revolver, and that all the other shell casings recovered from the scene of the shooting and from the van had been fired by the same .38 caliber weapon. So according to her, she basically determined without a doubt that both of the guns that were recovered were the same guns that were used to commit Blackie's homicide. And trip on this, in the past, I've ran stories about Perkins operations that were conducted in different county jails. And usually they're only used in homicide cases because of the liability and the danger that's involved with the plant that they use. But apparently, they conducted a small Perkins operation in this case. So from what I was able to find out, one of the homicide detectives, Dean Van Luan, coordinated this operation on June 20, 2014 at the Pacific Division substation on Culver City Boulevard. And it was performed in similar fashion as I had explained before. They bring in a plant, put them with the individual that they're trying to extract information from, and then at some point they wire up the plant so he can record it. You know, I'm not going to get into all the legalities and all the reasons why the sheriff's department's leadership and the command staff at most of the county jails don't like conducting Perkins operations. But one of the main reasons why they don't like doing them is based on the fact that corruption is so widespread and pervasive. And again, because of the potential exposure and liability that's involved, they don't want to open themselves up to an internal affairs investigation or some other type of criminal investigation that could result in them being hit with monetary penalties. And when you consider the potential problems of introducing audio and video recording capabilities into your jail that are given to a plant who might interact with officers that aren't aware that this operation is being conducted, the potential drawbacks raise serious concerns. Think about it, with all the existing widespread problems that they're having with officers who are getting caught up in smuggling in drugs, cell phones, and other forms of contraband or excessive force, they don't want to chance that type of exposure. Especially when you consider some of the controversial problems that the LA sheriff has had in the past with Lee Baca, the Rampart scandal, with Rafael Perez, David Mack, Nino Durden, Kevin Gaines, etc., etc. They don't want that kind of smoke, and they basically don't want to get caught with their pants down. But this didn't involve the LA County Jail. It was conducted at one of the smaller substations, which minimized the potential risk exponentially. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't have been authorized. So again, on June 20th, 2014, Detective Van Luan contacted a former gang member by the name of Armando Martinez and convinced him to assist with this Perkins operation. And they persuaded him to do this by compensating him with $1,000. And when they explained the circumstances behind his role, they told him that they were going to arrange to place him in a police holding cell with Silent and Dreamer separately, and that they wanted him to pose as an inmate. Furthermore, they also told him that they were going to furnish him with a recording device and that they wanted him to attempt to gather whatever information he could from interacting with them. And here's the thing, because of the legalities that are involved and because the detectives had to be careful about how this information was extracted, the detectives would later claim in court that the only thing that they told this plan Armando was that Silent and Dreamer were both 18th Street gang members. They claimed that they didn't divulge any information about the shooting, the felony pursuit, or anything else surrounding their arrest. The other key thing that the detectives claimed to avoid it from looking like they specifically paid this guy to extract information is that Armando wasn't paid on condition of whether or not Silent or Dreamer spoke to him. They claimed he was paid for just rendering his services in general. which is basically just wordplay and a slick way of avoiding the judge from suppressing it as tainted evidence, or under the fruits of the poisonous tree doctrine. So this guy Armando obviously had to look like a fellow gang member in order for Silent and Dreamer to feel comfortable enough to open up and talk to him. You couldn't just send anyone at him, otherwise they just avoid him and it would basically be counterproductive to the operation. But this guy Armando was supposedly a former drug dealer for the Mexican Mafia, and he had the number 13 tattooed on his right arm along with the chamali, the G shield, or the Aztec war shield that's supposed to signify status within that movement. And this guy had to have a little finesse about himself too. He couldn't have been no slouch, because unless you're just dealing with some loudmouth characters that like to expose their business, extracting that kind of information isn't no cakewalk. You have to know how to initiate that type of conversation, when to press when the door's open, when to back off when you're doing too much, and how to deflect if these guys start to get suspicious. Or like they say, when their spidey senses start tingling. You know, the last thing I'll say about this guy Armando is that he had a robbery conviction in 2001, and in 2010 he was arrested again by the DEA for conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine, and he ended up agreeing to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence. Then later on in 2015, his co-defendants were all convicted and he was placed on federal probation. So aside from Armando having an audio recording device, the particular holding cell that he was placed in with Silent was also equipped with a hidden video camera as well. So their interaction was recorded with both audio and video, something that would become instrumental later for the jury. Anyways, when Silent was eventually placed in the same holding cell as Armando, Silent introduced himself as Rocky from 18th Street. And he probably did this as a security caveat based on the fact that Silent didn't know this guy. You know, it's very common to use pseudonyms or fictitious names amongst gang members that don't know each other. And again, sometimes this is done as a security caveat to keep their real identity unknown. This is done all the time in prison, in the shoes and ad segs. Instead of using their real names over the tier, they'll go by a pseudonym or another name to throw people off, and they just keep their true identity off the tier. So after Silent introduced himself as Rocky from 18th Street, Armando reeled him in by telling him that he had just spoken to Dreamer, who was in another holding cell, and that Dreamer had told him that they were just involved in a high-speed pursuit. And this is what I'm talking about insofar as Armando knowing the language and knowing how to implement these kinds of bait and hook tactics. By telling Silent that he had just spoken to Dreamer, this gave Silent the impression that Dreamer had just talked to him and that he must have considered him to be trustworthy. And because Silent went for the banana in the tailpipe, he opened up immediately and confirmed it. But he didn't just confirm the high-speed pursuit they had gotten in. He also told Armando that he'd just gotten hit 2 days prior to this, and then he said, "That's what this shit's all about." Armando then said, "So you think it's behind the same shit?" And Silent said, "Yeah, that's what it is." From this point on, Silent just broke loose and started talking. He told Armando, "We approached some fool on 54th and Figueroa and asked him where he was from." Silent then made the mistake of implicating his two boys. He said, "All three of us let him have it." Armando responded by saying, "So all three of you got down? I thought it was just two of you." You know, this right here should have sent up a red flag, and it should have been a clear indicator that something was off, based on the fact that Dreamer obviously didn't mention anyone else being involved. But Silent was so caught up in the moment of exposing all the details that he didn't even catch it. Instead, he continued to implicate Bone by explaining to Armando that Dreamer and Bone had gotten out of the van before the shooting started, and that Bone fired first. Then him and Dreamer fired their weapons after, which didn't only implicate Bone, but it also revealed that there was a third weapon, something that the police didn't know nothing about. So he went on to tell him that when they were on the freeway, that they all threw their weapons out of the van's window when they were by the Manchester Avenue exit. And this obviously caused the cops to go back to that location by the Manchester Avenue exit off the freeway and do a secondary grid search to look for that third gun, which they did, and unfortunately for these guys, they were able to locate that weapon. But Silent still didn't stop talking. He continued to tell Armando that his baby mama told him that some fool from Temple Street did something to the homies and that he caught wind of it. He said, "I went to 51st Street looking for Temple Street gang members, and 3 of them ran and hid." Armando then asked Silent if they got the right one, if they took out the right one that they wanted. Silent responded by saying, "It was the right one that I wanted, but you know. So from there, Silent and Armando then discussed the seriousness of the potential charges that they were possibly facing and what could happen if they were convicted. Silent said, "I'll take 25 to life if they offer me 25 to life." Armando said, "You'll take it? Yeah, you're still young. You'll still have an opportunity to come home." And Silent said, "Yeah, that's what I'm saying." You know, I don't know what ended up happening to Silent later after he got convicted and landed in prison, but if I was going to take an educated guess, I'd probably say that he ended up on an S&Y for talking about the things that he did. You know, think about it. He implicated his co-defendants to a police informant, and I'm sure this had an adverse effect on them during trial. You know, who knows how Bone and Dreamer responded to this when they found out, but I would imagine that they were probably upset. Implicating yourself and burning yourself up is one thing, but implicating your co-defendants to an informant is almost looked at as borderline telling, because you're not supposed to repeat these things, and you're not supposed to talk about the things that they were involved in, especially when it's criminal. You know, one thing I can definitely tell you guys is that this recording, both the video and audio, was played for the jury, and that it was not only highly damaging, but it also had an adverse effect on how they voted on these charges. So when this case ultimately ended up going to trial, the defense did everything they could to assassinate Blackie's character by reminding the jury that he was a fellow gang member and that he had been involved in a laundry list of criminal misconduct, which isn't any different than any other good defense attorney would have also done themselves. Because let's keep it real, when it comes to gang members knocking down other gang members, individuals who have signed up for it and who know good and well what they're getting themselves involved in, the sentiment has always kind of been no harm, no foul. Despite the fact that they still look at it like it's a shame that young disillusioned teenagers and other young adults have become blinded by the mystique of that lifestyle and that they lose their lives at such young ages. On the flip side of it, it's different when so-called civilians are taken out or who have become collateral damage and catch strays when they're not involved. You know, they fall into the same category as hapless victims who've lost their lives to a destructive and cancerous epidemic that has plagued and contaminated a segment of society. An epidemic that's also known as gangbanging. So when the prosecutor laid out his case, he told the jury that in June of 2014, Blackie was living in a house that was located on the corner of 52nd Street between Figueroa and Hoover. He lived there with his brother, his sister, his brother's wife, Ruby Magana, and Ruby's children. And this house was located approximately about 1/3 of a mile from where Blackie was gunned down. And then the prosecutor went on to recite an incident that took place 4 days before Blackie's homicide that he believed might have motivated the events that led to his homicide. He said that approximately 4 days before Blackie's homicide, Silent was riding a bicycle past Blackie's house and that he looked at Ruby as she stood outside the residence. And I imagine he probably wasn't just shooting her a friendly gaze. He was probably looking at her in a way that's similar to what's described in prison when some of the inmates look at female officers for too long or when their eyes become fixated on certain areas or certain parts of their bodies. It's called reckless eyeballing. And don't quote me on this, but I think this is actually a form of misconduct or an infraction that you can be written up for. Honestly, I wouldn't know. I never hot dogged on the female officers like some of the other cats that just couldn't help themselves. But whatever the case was, and however Silent was looking at her, he obviously looked at her in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. So after the first incident, 2 days later, Ruby was outside in front of the house again with Blackie's brother and their kids when Ruby seen Silent drive by again real slow with Bone sitting in the passenger seat. You know, I don't know what Silent was doing, but this is starting to seem like he was lightweight stalking. But all bullshit aside, Silent did tell Armando, the police informant, that him and his homies from 18th Street were looking for Temple Street gang members by 51st Street. So maybe that's what they were doing, and Ruby just assumed that they were there scoping her out. At any rate, the van was described as being identical in color and as the same color, make, and model as the van that was used in Blackie's homicide. So when Blackie's brother seen Silent and Bone looking in his direction, he knew what that look meant when he seen it. So he immediately told Ruby to take the kids and go inside the house. So later, after Blackie's homicide, Ruby identified Silent and Bone from picture lineups, or what's known as six-packs that the detective showed her. However, again, later at trial, she equivocated her identifications either because she didn't want to be known as an informant or because she righteously didn't recognize the pictures. And there definitely was a cause for her to be concerned about her safety due to another 18th Street gang member by the name of Henry Calleros, who attended the trial during the entire time she testified. He sat there staring aggressively and angrily at her, and like her husband, she also knew exactly what that look meant. If you guys recall what I told you in the beginning of this story, Henry Calleros, who also went by Tricky, was romantically involved with Letty, the owner of the van. I told you guys that I thought it was odd that Silent and Dreamer would take off with Letty's van, knowing that she was with a fellow 18th Streeter, Tricky, unless they either didn't respect Tricky and thought he was a slouch, or because they knew she was just a side piece who he really didn't care about like that. Either way, Tricky was sitting there in the courtroom in the front row watching the trial, and based on the look he was giving Ruby, she knew it wasn't a good idea to testify against Silent, Bone, or Dreamer, and that's why she was struck with a severe case of selective memory, or of selective memory loss. Anyways, at one point when Ruby was walking by the front row of seats where Tricky was sitting, she came within a foot of him, and when she was walking by, he clenched his fist and actually lunged at her before he was restrained by the bailiffs and other people in the courtroom. So the prosecutor closed up his case by bringing in an LAPD cop by the name of Daniel Garcia, who apparently worked with the department's gang enforcement detail. He testified about all the usual gang signs, the symbols, the insignias, the historical advancement of 18th Street, and some of those who were credited with being some of the original founders. He also testified about how 18th Street was comprised of several different subsets and cliques, and how they operated regularly with impunity in each other's territory. And then he also testified about some of the primary activities of 18th Street being homicide, attempted homicide, witness intimidation, robbery, assault, and extortion. And I'm sure this was for the purpose of making the gang enhancement stick. And then he went into some of the predicate offenses that included two 18th Street gang members named Joe Rodriguez, who was convicted of 2 counts of attempted homicide in August of 2012, and Carlos Humberto Morales, who was convicted of homicide and attempted homicide in November of 2013. So Garcia closed up his testimony by testifying about the ongoing rivalry between 18th Street and Temple Street for the purpose of establishing a clear motive for Blackie's homicide. And neither Silent, Bone, or Dreamer testified on their own behalf and offered very little rebuttal evidence considering the amount of evidence that the prosecutor put on against them. Silent's attorney, however, brought in an individual by the name of Martin Flores, who came in and testified as the defense's gang expert. And the whole purpose for bringing Flores in was obviously to undermine the prosecution's theories that he was one of the shooters and that this specific act was done to benefit a criminal street gang, that obviously being 18th Street. The clear problem with Flores' testimony was that he contradicted every single one of the prosecution's theories, which at some point started to look like it was overkill and that it was all rehearsed. The smarter way to attack the case would have been to just attack some of the key points and then leave the rest of it for the jury to figure out for themselves. Because in the end, it didn't bode over well with the jury when they deliberated, and this was something that was inherently obvious to them. But the defense attorneys still put on a contentious defense, and they attacked the source of both the video and audio recordings between Silent and Armando that were part of the Perkins operation. But unfortunately for them, they lost that fight as well. The court ultimately ended up ruling that these conversations didn't violate any state or federal due process laws and that there is no expectation of privacy in a holding cell or in a county jail setting. At any rate, after the jury deliberated for a short period of time, they came back with guilty verdicts on Silent, Dreamer, and Bone on all counts. It was a landslide. They got found guilty on everything. It was a complete wash. So in the end, Silent was sentenced to a total of 50 years to life in state prison, consisting of an indeterminate term of 25 years to life for the homicide and a consecutive 25 years to life for the gun enhancement. The court also imposed an additional 7 years for the 186.22, the gang enhancement. The court sentenced Bone to a total of 53 years to life in state prison, consisting of an indeterminate term of 25 years to life for the homicide and a consecutive 25 years to life for the gun enhancement. And finally, the court sentenced Dreamer to a total of 63 years to life in state prison, consisting of an indeterminate term of 25 years to life for the homicide and 25 years to life for the gun enhancement. The court also imposed an additional 7 years for the 186.22, the gang enhancement, and an additional consecutive 10 years for a second gun enhancement. So once again, there you have it. 4 more lives destroyed by some senseless acts that were all committed within a few short minutes. Jose Horta, Blackie from Temple Street, lost his life that night, and his family has to endure the pain caused by his loss for the rest of their lives. Dreamer, Bone, and Silent will more than likely spend the rest of their natural lives in prison until one day when they will eventually expire, alone, broken, and defeated in a concrete box. If they're lucky, it'll be from old age. Otherwise, it'll be from some type of sinister, violent way motivated behind cutthroat politics. So today, Silent's house somewhere in Mill Creek State Prison. Bone is housed somewhere in Donovan State Prison, and Dreamer is housed in Avenal. I have no information as to whether or not they're still active, but based on Silent being housed in Mill Creek, it's probably pretty safe to say that he's burnt up and is no longer active. I can only wonder if it had anything to do with the way he implicated his co-defendants. It's unfortunate, but as you guys know, these stories come a dime a dozen. And it's sad how these guys throw their whole lives away by making one impulsive, senseless choice in a few short split seconds of time. When I think about some of the events that took place in this story, one of the most sobering things that happened was when Silent was having that conversation about how much time he was looking at with Armando, the plant that assisted the detectives with the Perkins operation. At one point during their conversation about Silent facing 25 years to life, and they rationalized the circumstances of the situation Silent was in by agreeing that he was still young and that he still had some years of his life to spare. That's part of a sad reality that some of these guys place on the value of their lives and their time on this planet. Silent said it almost like saying, yeah, I can give up 25 years and still have some semblance and quality of life left when I'm deep into my 50s. Like he was just brokering 25 years away, believing he still has some years to spare. That's a shame how life has little or no value to some of these guys, or that at least it seemed that way during that time. And I'm sure Silent probably meant it in that moment when he said it. But at some point in his life, as he got older, I'm sure his thought process probably changed over time with regards to this, and eventually he wouldn't have such a shallow perspective on his life, because these types of things tend to change as we get older. Trust me on that. Time slips by and we recognize the value of it as that clock keeps on ticking. This is something I hope none of you ever lose sight of. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. And again, something else that's extremely important that I'm going to continue to keep reminding you guys about is to not only hit the like, drop a comment, and share the video, but also hit the all symbol on the notification bell so that you're advised whenever I drop content on the channel. So with that being said, as always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and for also continuing to tap into the channel. In the meantime, you guys enjoy the rest of your day and keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.